Today, we're joined by Shaun Rein. He is the founder and managing director of the China Market Research Group, CMR, the world's leading strategic market intelligence firm focused on China. He works with boards, billionaires, heads of states, CEOs, and senior executives of Fortune 500 and leading Chinese companies, private equity firms, SMEs, and long hedge funds to develop their China growth, political, and investment strategies. Now, Rein authored the international bestseller book, The War for China's Wallet, Profiting from the New World Order, and also The End of Cheap China and The End of Copycat China. Now, welcome, Shaun. Would you just briefly give us a short version of this 5 weeks of lockdown, why it happened, and what are the authorities waiting for it to be over?
So it's great to be here, Christian. Hello, everyone. I'm sitting here actually in my home. I've just started week 6 of my lockdown in Shanghai. I'm actually in my closet right now. And when we say lockdown in Shanghai, it's different, I think, than lockdown in many other countries. In Shanghai, when we say lockdown, you're not even supposed to go outside. You're not allowed to go to a grocery store. So you get locked into first your home, and you also get locked into your housing compound. Most people in Shanghai live in gated communities. Even the poorer people will live in an area that's gated around. But what is the genesis? How did this all start? Well, let me go back 2 years ago, Christian, because a lot of people don't realize just how good China had actually contained COVID over the last 2 years. Since March of 2020, we basically had some interruptions to our daily life, but there weren't many draconian policies like the New York Times has said. Basically, we had to show a health code on our mobile phone if we wanted to get into a shopping mall, or if we wanted to get into a restaurant, or if we wanted to get onto an airplane. But for the most part, our lives are relatively unaffected. You know, we could get around. I went to almost half of China's provinces in the last 2 years. So about 7-8 weeks ago, this is what happened in Shanghai. We started to get some cases. And so originally the Shanghai government said they had a lot of confidence. They felt that over the previous 2 years, they were able to contain COVID. So they wanted to try to contain this Omicron outbreak without having too much impact on all of our daily lives. So 8 weeks ago, this is what happened. If somebody got sick or had COVID and they were in a KFC, they would lock the KFC down. And they would lock all of the diners in the KFC there for 2 to 3 days and get tested. And if somebody went to a Starbucks, they would lock the Starbucks down. But they would leave the malls or the restaurants next door relatively open. So I remember going to eat at a restaurant and seeing the Starbucks next door locked down with people on the inside. What started to happen, though, was I think it's clear that you can't be cute. You can't sort of stay ahead of Omicron. You just have to shut completely. So the cases just started getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So, you know, like I said, in my compound, which is one of the first to get shut, we got shut completely for what was supposed to be 48 hours. And 48 hours got extended now. As I said, I'm in my 6th week. And that's what that's what caused some of the problems, which we can get into later. But that gives, I think, the audience a good sort of backdrop of, you know, China did well. The Shanghai municipal authorities thought they were going to do well here, but the Omicron just got out of hand.
Look, I had some other questions to ask, but I have to dive into this because this is just for somebody like in Japan, we of course never experienced anything like that. So I would first ask why this draconian policy, all of a sudden, this change of the game completely of this lockdown thing, and starting to lock down basically the small marts, the small shops. Where this idea come from? Is that a specific Chinese? Is somebody think out this policy?
So I think there's 2 things. One, most people in China don't consider it to be draconian policies, especially in Shanghai. We felt that these policies are what kept us safe over the last 2 years. And so people weren't upset about people getting locked down in KFC. It just meant people were nervous to go outside because they didn't want to get locked in a restaurant. People actually right now are not that upset about being locked in their homes. What they are upset about is the implementation of some of the policies, especially in the first 2 weeks, which were chaotic, which were shameful, and never should have happened in Shanghai. But over the last 3 weeks, the situation has gotten markedly better. And we can talk about the before problems as well as the solutions as Beijing or the central government has gotten involved. But I'll give an example, Christian. This is what happened to my family. So in the morning, I walked out of my compound on a morning walk, and all of a sudden we got locked in while I was out walking. So when I came back, we were already under lockdown, which meant that nobody was able to prepare. We weren't able to buy food. We weren't able to buy medicine. You know, I know people who had their kids out at, sleepovers at friends' homes. They couldn't get their children back. So it just got locked down. Now you ask, why is the government doing this? I think it comes down to a couple things. One, again, the zero COVID policy that China has run over the last 2 years has been fairly successful. Our lives lived pretty well. As I mentioned, I traveled around the country. Two, the economy has still been growing at a 5 to 6% GDP growth rate. So the draconian policies didn't have a huge effect negatively on the economy. And then three, I think politically, Xi Jinping, the chairman of China, Communist Party, has really made this zero COVID policy the bedrock of his campaign or his leaderships. And he's the one who's saying we need to maintain dynamic zero COVID. And that's why everybody's been doing it.
I wonder though, like, was there, because I think there's a lot of minds behind this, like thinking to solve this problem. Zero COVID means zero cases. And I mean,
well, they actually call it dynamic zero COVID. So that's that they always add that word dynamic, which I think in the translations in English, they don't always talk about. They always say that China's running zero COVID. They're actually not running zero COVID. It's dynamic zero COVID. So they're okay with 5, 10, 20 cases in a city, which is why Shanghai stayed open at first until 20 cases suddenly became 20,000 cases a day.
Well, that's a very, very, very interesting clause that you brought about, because yes, I never heard about the dynamic part. It's good to mention, like as you say, it's not as draconian as everybody thought, I guess, so far. But let me understand, like, since the Omicron Cabo, they call it Cabo here, the Omicron variant came out, most of the countries, a lot of countries, they considered it like something like a bonanza, like something that would even substitute the vaccine itself, because being low in the level of being effective in a sense of really hurting people, old people or younger people, but of course being able to spread a lot faster. But why did this become with the Omicron, which again, like, it's not, we had many other variants that were much more effective in actually killing people and bringing people to the hospitals. So why this all began with the Omicron? Is there any distinction at all when making these policies between the different variants?
I think that's a very legitimate criticism or question or concern. And I think a lot of people have said the same thing. We've now had wreaked havoc on Shanghai's economy. A lot of people have had a lot of pressure. Some people have died actually because they were locked down and then they were unable to get to the doctors and get medical treatment. There's been a lot of mental illness emerging over the last month. Clearly, when you see some of the WeChat groups of neighbors talking, there's anguish, there's desperation, there's anger, which sometimes is quite scary. So some people do wonder, is the medicine worse than the disease? Especially when you see that only about 10, 15 people have died in Shanghai in the last month from COVID. And all of them, I believe, were over the age of 60 and were unvaccinated. And so for a lot of people, they're saying, well, we see pictures of all of the people who are sent away into the quarantine centers, and about 300,000 Shanghainese have been sent to these giant centers. Some of them have been exhibition halls that have been converted into 15,000 bed quarantine centers. And most of them have asymptomatic. Most of them, you see videos of them dancing and they're still doing Tai Chi or dancing. So a lot of people do wonder, is it worth it? Now, I'm not an epidemiologist. I'm not a doctor. I'm not going to argue on that. My belief if you're just asking me as a human or as an economist, is that zero COVID makes sense for China, or dynamic zero COVID continues to make sense because a lot of people will get sick, a lot of people will die. However, I think Shanghai, when the situation got so bad, you reached the point where maybe zero COVID didn't make sense for Shanghai specifically. What I would have considered doing is keeping zero COVID for the rest of China, but easing it in Shanghai, using us as a case study to see how many people would get truly sick, would people truly die. Let us continue to work, let us be open, but lock Shanghai down from the rest of the country and almost view Shanghai as a separate country. That's probably what I would have done. Now, I think the government has gotten a pretty good handle. We're about 16 asymptomatic cases today, down from about 22,000 3-4 days ago. So you're seeing that we might have passed the curve. But what I'm very concerned about is just the ongoing financial hardship. So I do have some worry from the ongoing lockdown. I think first and foremost that there won't be a significant impact, not just on Shanghai's economy, but also overall China's and the world from this lockdown. When you look at it, China, Shanghai's port is 4 times larger than Los Angeles in the United States. So it's going to have a big impact. You know, they've kept some of the businesses ongoing, like in the financial sector, like the stock market has continued. They actually have employees living in office buildings for the last 3 weeks so that you could continue to have. You're now seeing that factories like Tesla has announced they're reopening, and they're going to have all of the employees actually live at the factories in a closed loop system. But you have definitely a dent on business confidence. That's one part. Second, I think a lot of foreign expats are quite frustrated about what happened. This will certainly have an impact on FDI, foreign direct investment into China. You're going to see a lot of the expats are going to view Shanghai now as a hardship. And especially, I think, for companies that put their regional, like Asia Pacific headquarters in Shanghai, that's a problem. You know, if everything gets shut, they might say, well, maybe we need to go to Singapore or a place that's not going to completely lock down, because it's quite possible that even when we get out of this, in 3 months or 4 months, there could be another lockdown for a week or two. And so that's going to wreak havoc on, a company's entire Asia Pacific operations. Third, you just see something like a lot of international school teachers have just quit. They've just resigned, and they're moving back to their home countries, because for international school teachers, they don't really have many physical assets in China or Shanghai. They probably haven't bought a house. They aren't here in China for 10, 20 years. They're not looking at working at this international school long-term. They like to do 2 years in Shanghai, 2 years in Ho Chi Minh, 2 years in Oman, 2 years in Dubai. A lot of them are fleeing right now. And if the schools can't find good teachers, the expatriate executives are not going to want to work here. And then finally, I'm quite worried about the mental health of people in Shanghai. It has been tough because there have been difficulties at times of securing food. There have definitely been issues securing water. So people have been nervous. And when I talk to poorer Chinese, when I talk to wealthier, billionaire Chinese friends, they all, not all, but many of them sound depressed and are exhibiting some areas of mental health issues from this. So I do worry that there's going to be an ongoing problem. Now, long term, I think Shanghai will bounce back. 3 to 5 years from now, Shanghai is going to be fine. It's still the greatest city in the world. I've been living here for 19 years, but it would be naive to underestimate the slew of difficulties that Shanghai is going to have to overcome in the next 3 to 6 months, especially, but actually over the next 1 to 3 years.
I will just go and stop with a couple of more questions. One comes from one of your tweets that you just recently tweeted out. You said that Shanghai's problems are not due to China's zero COVID policy. They're due to Shanghai not adhering to Beijing's strict policy from the beginning. Could you just briefly explain this from somebody, again, like who doesn't know closely the dynamics of power between Beijing and Shanghai, which everybody knows, has this local government with some autonomy. So how much is this autonomy really? So what is this conflict?
Sure, two things on this. First off, I hate Twitter. I can't stand Twitter. So I'm on Twitter. I think it's just such a disgusting place. I'm a much nicer person than I appear on Twitter. Most people tell me. But anyway, I think when people think of China, they think of real top-down. And there is some truth to that. But there's also a lot more flexibility at the local level than a lot of people realize. And so when you saw actually Shanghai and Shenzhen, another major city, one of the 3-4 most important ones, way down in the south, the COVID cases were getting bad in both cities at the same time. And what happened was Shenzhen said, we're going to shut for 7 days straight and totally lock down. And that's when Shanghai said, no, we're going to be cute and we're going to lock people up in a KFC or a Starbucks. We're going to lock one compound down for 48 hours. Shenzhen basically did what Beijing wanted, which was that dynamic zero COVID strategy, the quote unquote draconian lockdowns. Shanghai didn't want to do that. And, you know, the first 2 weeks of the lockdown, I had problems buying food. Okay, like the individual couriers would not come to my compound. I live in a relatively small compound. So what started happening is people did group buying where neighbors would come together and you could buy strawberries or meat directly from the maker, directly from the farmer in some cases. But they would only deliver if they could say deliver 500 packages of meat. So that ended up meaning they would send to the larger compounds with 50-story high building apartments and density. I live in a relatively low dense place, so I couldn't get food. And even when food came, that meant a security guard would have to go on a bike and bike to all the individual homes. So it could take him 12 hours instead of going up in an elevator and delivering to 50 floors in an hour period. So what that meant was Shanghai got hit hard. And we started to have food problems, access to medicine, and it was really not pleasant. I mean, people were breaking down over whether or not they could eat. What that meant was the situation in Shanghai, the local level, got so out of control that Beijing stepped in. And Beijing sent in a vice premier named Sun Chunlan, who came in, and she basically said, stop this crap. Lock down the whole city. Stop saying it's 48 hours. Stop saying it's 5 days. It's going to be weeks and weeks and weeks of lockdown. The second thing she did was she was able to mobilize neighboring provinces like Zhejiang and Jiangsu to be able to send food to us. And so I think what happens in China a lot is the Beijing is definitely powerful, but there's a lot more latitude and leeway given to local governments until they screw up. And then once they screw up, the central government comes in, mobilizes resources and fixes things. So I was very critical of the lockdown the first 2 weeks because it was a man-made humanitarian disaster. There was a lot of mistakes made by the local officials. Right now, am I happy? No. I mean, it's been 3 weeks, since the Beijing came in, and I'm still not able to go outside, and my business is in trouble, and I'm not happy being stuck here. But I can't really complain because the central government has done a good job. I have access to food now. I even got shaving cream a couple days ago. My hair is still kind of wild, but considering the difficulty, life is okay right now. And that's why what typically happens in China, and this is different from the US, Chinese aren't stupid, okay? Chinese will criticize government, but most of the time their sharpest criticism is geared towards local governments because there's a belief that the central government will come in and resolve all things and bring very sharp accountability. And that's what we're starting to see in Shanghai. Shanghai local authorities screwed up. Sun Chunlan, the vice premier, came from Beijing. Things are much better now. And now many, and I hope many more, and I hope many more senior officials to come have been fired. At the moment, it's being repeated everywhere. So like Shenyang, Hangzhou, Suzhou, a lot of cities are under lockdown right now because no official wants to be the one that lets 5 cases turn into 300,000 cases like in Shanghai. Because the central government brings such ruthless accountability. If you're the party secretary of a city, nearby like a Suzhou of 9 million people, and cases go from 5, and I think they had 15 cases yesterday, to 300,000, you're in trouble. So they're locking cities down. And this is why I think there's going to be a lot more struggle in the second half of 2022 economically than many people realize. I think the economy in Q1 was only 4.8% GDP growth. It's going to be a real struggle. And that's why a lot of foreign businesses are saying, can we invest in China right now? Because if we invest here, it's not just Shanghai, it's other cities are going to go through lockdowns. And so why don't we wait a year or two until China either opens up or COVID is gone, and then we'll come in with FDI. A lot of companies are saying, you know what, let's just go to Vietnam. Let's go to India. Let's go to other countries that are more open for business right now, and where executives can fly in and out. Because this is one of the things we haven't talked about, Christian, is it's been virtually impossible or very difficult for foreign executives, even over the last 2 years, to fly to Shanghai. So, it's very hard for a Fortune 500 company to say, we're going to invest $5 billion into China when the global CEO, the head of Asia Pac, the board can't come and visit. That's an issue. And I actually know a lot of seriously big companies that have not even had their country head in China for the last 2 years because they got stuck outside during the initial COVID wave in 2020.
Given all this, we're going to close it here, even though I would love to speak more, and we might do this again. Given all this, is this zero COVID policy still finds the support of the vast majority of Chinese, you think?
It absolutely does. I think the vast majority of Chinese definitely support this dynamic zero COVID policy because, again, for the last 2 years, we've lived a relatively good life. We've been able to travel. We haven't worried about our health, and the economy hasn't been great, but it's been okay. So the vast majority of Chinese still support it. I wouldn't say the same about people in Shanghai. I think once you get locked down, a lot of people don't like it anymore. But I think for the betterment of society, maybe. Now, the other thing we haven't talked about is in October, most likely, is when you're going to have a major People's Congress meeting where there's rumors that Xi Jinping will get a 3rd term as the party secretary, chairman. And so people are saying before then, it'd be politically too risky to open up to living with COVID. So at least through October, we're definitely going to have zero COVID. And I actually see that as being a very good likelihood.
So you think that by giving it up now would be like an admission of failure on the part of the central government and Xi Jinping in particular?
Yeah, I think some people would view it that way because the dynamic zero COVID policy has worked in China for 2 years. It's kept the economy going and it's kept us safe. And the big fear, it's how China survived COVID and beat it has been one of the things compared to the United States, compared to Brazil, compared to India, the world's largest democracies, has actually been a major propaganda point by the Communist Party saying, look at how well our system has done while the democracies have done worse.
Sure. Just a final thought, because you mentioned about the big companies, they have troubled the head of these companies to come to China. How about the little business, the middle businesses? I'm not talking really about like the hair masseuse or the restaurant or the local shops. How angry are they? Are they angry even? Because
I don't think they're not angry, but they're frustrated because a lot of these people are not rich. They work on commission, essentially. So if they don't do a foot massage, or if they don't give a haircut, or if they don't serve food, they don't get paid for that day. So for a lot of them, they haven't been able to earn for a month. And a lot of these people are migrant workers. So they might be from a poor province like Anhui or Hunan, and they come here to earn money and remit the money back to their families back in the countryside. And so this pain is not just hitting people in Shanghai, it's also hitting the families spread out all over China who rely on the remittances from their family members who work in Shanghai. I think there's definite frustration there. They don't have big savings. So I think the economic pain from this is much more serious than a lot of people realize. And also tax. Here's another thing. We've been getting COVID tests constantly. I think I've had 3 days in a row where I have to get a COVID test, and it's all free. But at some point, somebody has to pay for that. So it's going to come from taxes somewhere. So it's going to be, there's definitely an impact.
So do you think at this point that the lockdown in Shanghai will be over in October when the elections are?
I do. I mean, you've seen actually the cases were hitting 25,000 or so about a week ago, and they've been dropping about 2,000 a day since then. So I think there's actually a pretty good likelihood that in the next 2 to 4 weeks, we actually will get down to a reasonable number and we'll be able to get out. I think people will still be scared to go out of their compounds. And so that will continue to impact retail, restaurants, and things like that. But I think it's clear we've passed that negative curve. I think in about a month, we should be relatively okay. Knocking on wood, because I'd like to get outside and play.
All right. Well, thank you so much for talking to us today, Shaun Rein. Thank you. Well, we might talk again and have an update if anything changes.
Thank you for having me, Christian. Have a great day.
Good luck. Good luck.